So it seems like we've already gotten to the next step of our conversation, which I think is on everyone's mind. Higher ed is not a static system. One change leads to another. So Renu mentioned the potential for lawsuits. Musa, you talked about, if criteria are changing to focus more on subjective things, and I also know, many universities are dropping standardized tests or reducing their importance. I'd love to hear from everyone. Granted, we're all speculating, but with this many moving pieces, what's the equilibrium that might emerge over the next few years? I mean, Rachel, you've probably thought about this. Let me ask you for starters, what do we think the new normal is going to be, or will there be one?
Well, I think, we already mentioned the possibility that there will be litigation because the essays are used in some way that subverts the race neutrality of the process. But I do think there's a real question about what race neutrality means, because many universities are likely to consider other criteria: socioeconomic status, zip code, percentage plans, doing away with standardized tests. There's many things that you might do, considering first generation status. And the Pacific Legal Foundation has already said, if you use these proxies with the desire to promote racial and ethnic diversity, that's impermissible, because you can't take these steps based on a racial motivation. So I'm sure there will be litigation, and there's already been test litigation against at least two selective high schools, in which they said that the high schools redid their admissions criteria to promote diversity, and that was impermissible. Now, that litigation hasn't uniformly succeeded, but I do think it's laying the groundwork for the challenges in higher education to come. I think the other destabilization that you're seeing is the legacy admissions. On the front page of the New York Times today was an announcement that the Office for Civil Rights is investigating Harvard's preferences for legacy admissions, alleging that it advantages privileged whites. Now, the question is whether that was racially motivated. Because if it was actually motivated by a desire to generate money from people who can make large donations, for example, or to recruit faculty, or to maintain good alumni relations, Harvard could say, we did this and it did incidentally benefit whites, but that's because most wealthy people in America who can make large donations are white. Most of our alumni are white because of prior admissions in another era, and the faculty pool is mostly white. And so I think there will be ongoing debates about what is racially motivated and impermissible and what is race neutral on both sides.
I wonder whether the legal importance on sort of almost an institution's state of mind or motivations, and these sort of wink and nod kind of practices and admissions doesn't actually hurt the academy in some way. I mean, we talk a lot about being a truth-seeking organization and being open in our arguments. It seems a little cloak and dagger and not necessarily going to get better. I mean, Renu, does that worry you?
It does worry me. And actually, one of my colleagues here at the Manhattan Institute, Robert Verbruggen, in early June, a few weeks before SCOTUS released this decision, had published a report on what race-neutral alternatives are going to look like and how they might affect the higher education landscape. And his conclusion, one of his focus cases, was the University of California system in the aftermath of Proposition 209, was that this is just going to drive everything further underground. And also in the sense that if you have, for example, an explicit racial preference, now this is of course something that I don't support. The court has recognized in my mind, rightfully so, that it violates the Equal Protection Clause. But in that sense, if you're an admissions officer and you have, say, a racial quota of you want 15% underrepresented minorities in your incoming class, you're going to do your admission scheme to just, include about 15%. But if you can't have that explicitly anymore, and you have to turn to instead race neutral alternatives that are in fact racial proxies, you're going to be applying that over a much greater percentage than just, the target you have in mind to then yield your target. So you might have to, extend that to 30% to then end up yielding 15%. So I think that this is going to drive everything further underground and also actually lead to larger preferences that are then going to have, greater academic mismatch effects, for example. And so I do think things are going to get a bit worse before they get better.
Musa, you've looked a lot as a sociologist at winners and losers, different perceptions, different motivations in this whole storm. How do you see it playing out?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I have concern about that I alluded to briefly before was that a lot of the alternative metrics that schools would use to select people in lieu of what they're currently doing can actually be really easily gamed by like wealthy families, and can in some respects be gamed even more easily than the existing metrics. So for instance, you can at schools like UPenn, for instance, so a lot of schools are trying to provide advantage to first-gen students or to students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. Okay, but how they define that is very important. So at UPenn, for instance, you count as a first-generation student if your parents didn't graduate from an Ivy League school. So if you're someone who's the son of a doctor who graduated from University of Arizona and a lawyer who graduated from Arizona State, you count as a first-gen student when you apply to UPenn, which is, wild. UCLA, similarly, you count as a first-gen student if your parents didn't graduate from a school in the United States. So if you're, again, a child of a doctor and a lawyer, but one went to Oxford and the other graduated from Cambridge, you count as a first-gen student. And the problem is institutions have an incentive because they want to, amp up their numbers, their diversity numbers. They want to show that they're, achieving. So the institutions as well actually have a kind of a perverse incentive to structure these things in such a way that they can still get the kind of affluent people that they're aiming for, but also make it look like they're really diverse and inclusive. And that's what you're seeing already at a number of institutions. And I think that's going to get worse. And then just briefly, I'll say on the flip side as well, you're seeing rich families, affluent families already gaming some of these systems. So for instance, a trend that's already underway and will probably get worse is that you have people from affluent families legally emancipating their children so that their children then they don't count the parents' income anymore, and the children generally have zero income because they're not working, and so they can qualify then as for they get an admissions advantage in virtue of being a low-income student technically, and they get to go to school for free instead of their families paying the $80,000 a year at Columbia, for instance. And so this is already a thing that's happening. It will probably get worse if they put increased weight on socioeconomic disadvantage. Yeah, so as I'm looking forward, a lot of these alternative things are just really easy to get.
We've here